One thing I really enjoy doing is when I'm commissioned for new work, I love the idea of creating a work that is in homage and reflective to a culture that's local to that ensemble. And so what that does is it brings awareness to that local tribe, and also hopefully it creates a handshake between that arts organization and their local Native people.
Hello and welcome to Art Restart, where we explore how artists are reinventing their fields and building a new landscape for the arts. I'm Piercarlo Talenti, the producer and editor of this podcast, a production of the Thomas S. Keenan Institute for the Arts at the University of North Carolina School of the Arts. In a departure from my usual MO, and for reasons that I'm sure will be very clear to you in a second, I'm going to let my guest introduce himself.
Hachinchukmaataa Tate, Chickasaw Nompa Okano Soholshifoa, Jerod Impichchaachaaha Tate, Chickasaw Saya, Chickasaw Inki Saya, Impichchaachaaha Choka Michashawi Iksai Shtown Chololili, Taloa Ikbili, Hashlaka Asayopa, Chukmashki, Yakoke. Hello, everyone. My name is Jerod Impichchaachaaha Tate. I'm a citizen of the Chickasaw Nation here in Oklahoma, and I am a professional classical composer.
The piece we're currently hearing is Jerod's composition titled Minko, which means chief in Chickasaw. I spoke to Jerod when he just returned to his Oklahoma City home after an eventful week in New York City, where he worked on two projects. First, he heard the New York Philharmonic play the string arrangement premiere of his piece Pisachi. And then his work was also performed at Carnegie Hall, with the American Composers Orchestra performing the New York premiere of his piece titled Clans. And get this, he also performed in it, singing alongside his 10-year-old son, Heloha. And they were joined on stage by several fellow members of the Chickasaw Nation who were dressed in traditional regalia. Jerod himself was inducted into the Chickasaw Nation Hall of Fame in 2022. His work has been performed all over the country, and the rest of this musical season will remain really busy for him. Dover String Quartet is touring one of his newest works, Woodland Songs. Oklahoma's Canterbury Voices will premiere his first opera, Lokshi Shali, which means shell shaker. And he will curate an all-American Indian music program in Washington, D.C. for the Post-Classical Ensemble. I started our interview by asking Jerod how he moved from being a classical pianist to becoming a composer who's comfortable merging indigenous and European musical traditions.
Well, I'll give you a little background about myself, and this will answer a lot of perspective questions. Of course, I come from my parents, and my father, Charles, is Chickasaw from Oklahoma, and Dad professionally was a tribal judge and special district judge, an attorney. And so with my dad's profession, I grew up very immersed in North American Indian history and law and politics. And so I just had a really, really great cosmopolitan general education about Indian country in general, along with being a Chickasaw person. So I was saturated with my own tribal culture, but also cultures from other tribes around North America. And so my dad just gave me a really, really beautiful education all the way around on those fronts. But also, Dad is a phenomenally trained classical pianist and baritone. And so my Chickasaw father, was the one that started me on the piano, and I grew up with him singing and playing repertoire in the house. And one thing I'd love to brag about is my dad also played accordion, and he gigged accordion in restaurants. And so my father would sing classical arias on accordion in restaurants. It was like Lady and the Tramp.
That's amazing.
But here you got this Chickasaw guy doing this, in Oklahoma. I mean, only in America could you see something like this happening. That's something that a lot of folks are not aware of, and that is, the history of American Indians is very, very robust and very, very rich. And we've had contact across the seas for the last 600-700 years. And it wasn't just all at once. I mean, it was in little chunks and migrations. And so, just like any part of the world, when two cultures come in contact with each other, they immediately share and trade. That's just normal to human experience.
But in terms of cultural exchanges, what we haven't generally heard is a marriage of classical Western music with Chickasaw music.
Well, that's very true. So this is, there are no other symphonic Chickasaw composers, and so I'm a little unique on that front. However, it's the idea is not new to Indian country, and so just little by little, more American Indians are being more and more involved in different professions and genres of art. And in fact, it's like, we have martial arts that we teach in the Chickasaw language, all with Chickasaw commands. So it's not just Western that we are mixing things with, but we also have, different cultures around the world that we do the same. I'll be honest, I have a little bit of pushback on the idea of like Western classical meets or verses or something like that, because, the idea of Western classical music is, it didn't originate in one time zone that contains, Paris and London. And in fact, the history of Western fine art in general, in all of the genres of theater and dance and music and visual arts, has its roots in Northern Africa and the Middle East. And before Europe was indoctrinated and became proficient at that and gave its contribution. So Europe is actually only one chapter of the development of the fine arts that now exists all over the world. So if you think about it, it's like the fine arts that came from Greece, like in music, it's like a sentient being. It's like it had its roots in a very specific discipline in learning music, but it moves all over the planet, and wherever it goes, it literally is begging people to bring in their individual identity into a specific discipline. And that's exactly what it did. And so if you look at Europe as a microcosm of that, well, it went to Italy, and then it went to France, and then Great Britain, and then, of course, then to Russia. And the competition every single time it moved around was very, very intense and positively fierce. Then after that, it made its way across the oceans. And so you've got composers like Toru Takemitsu, who is an unbelievably Japanese symphonic composer, undeniably Japanese. You've got Chin Ryung, who's undeniably Cambodian, and of course, but then you've got people like Charles Ives and George Crumb, who were extremely American in their approach. And so this happens all over the planet. And so the fine arts does that very much like the martial arts do. It's like everybody can learn the martial arts. The discipline remains, but people bring in their own energy and their own identity into the discipline of the art.
Absolutely. I mean, art always borrows, steals, evolves.
Bingo.
And now with social media, art is evolving even faster.
Oh, well, with Spotify, oh my gosh, I listen to Spotify all the time. And so I'm constantly re-influenced as a modern composer. And I really, really enjoy that. Well, that brings you to kind of the second chapter of my artistic journey. And that is my mother, Patricia, was Manx. So I am Manx and Chickasaw, and my mother was a professional choreographer and dancer. So between my two parents, I grew up saturated with American musical theater and opera and dance. So I grew up being influenced like that. I was also very exposed to the great ballets of Stravinsky and Tchaikovsky and Prokofiev when I was a kid, and Ravel and Debussy. And so my mother choreographed all of these for her students. She was a teacher at the University of Wyoming for 30 years, and she set these great ballets. So I was saturated with this great symphonic work. Dare I say, the finest symphonic work ever created was for some of these ballets. And so to me, it was normal to hear these types of instrumentations and also the treatment of folk melodies from people's cultures. So, you have somebody like Tchaikovsky, who's constantly with all the national dances in ballet. Well, that was all homage to different cultures from neighboring cultures from Tchaikovsky. And so I was exposed to a lot of that when I was a kid. And so my mother also did original ballets. And at one point, she decided she wanted to do something that was relevant to Indian country in Wyoming, wanted to do a ballet based on American Indian stories from the Northern Plains and Rockies. So she started to put together stories, and she consulted with her native colleagues up in Wyoming to create the architecture of a collection of stories that she wanted to be in the ballet. that included a narrator as well. I was all part of that. I was, she told me the stories and the whole process, and I was very hip to what was happening. And then came time and she's like, okay, so now, Jerod, I'd really like you to compose the score. And I'm about passed out. She's like, well, you're my Chickasaw, classical pianist, kid, you can do the score. And she's like, my process. And she was absolutely correct. Now, I will tell you, I said no. I was absolutely floored by this whole proposal. And I'll be honest with you, I was overwhelmed because the pressure that I felt from both Indian country and the classical world was overwhelming. I mean, here I grew up with the finest American Indian visual art you could ever, and stories and poetry. And I mean, I had that weight of Indian country on my shoulders. And then also, here's Tchaikovsky and Prokofiev. And I'm like, what am I going to do with myself with all this immense artistic accomplishment on both sides of my upbringing? Well, I eventually said yes, and that's how I started composing. And so my first work was Winter Moons, was a ballet score that actually is on Spotify now. And we brought in a narrator named Rodney Grant, who is an Omaha Indian actor who lives in Los Angeles now. He's a good friend of mine, and he was one of the stars in Dances with Wolves. And so we asked him to come and be the narrator. He accepted. And this guy came in like thunder, just absolutely hammering me, saying, Jerod, you've got to do this. This is amazing. You've got to become an American Indian symphonic composer. This has got to happen. It's got to happen. Well, Lewis Ballard was also a big hero of mine, who was a Quapaw Cherokee composer from Oklahoma. And Lewis was doing very, very similar things as Bartok, where he was, framing our cultural music within symphonic literature. And so I did the ballet, and then I took it down to Lewis afterwards in Santa Fe and was able to share that. And he gave me great support, which I'm very grateful for. But I just kind of did it in secret because I was so nervous. But Rodney was there saying, you got it. So we premiered the ballet, toured it, had very good success with it. And my support from both Indian country and the classical world was very, very high. And so I decided to go ahead and then go back to the Cleveland Institute of Music and add composition to my degree.
Your bio says that you've worked in, I believe, 20 native cultures and languages.
Mm-hmm.
How do you go about steeping yourself in a native culture that is not Chickasaw? What kind of research is involved, and how much more time and effort does that add to your composition work?
Well, that's a very, very good question. I really appreciate being able to talk about that. So first of all, one thing I really enjoy doing is when I'm commissioned for new work, I love the idea of creating a work that is in homage and reflective to a culture that's local to that ensemble. And so what that does is it brings awareness to that local tribe, and also hopefully it creates a handshake between that arts organization and their local Native people. I see that as opportunity for handshakes and collaboration. So hopefully I kind of see myself as like a spark or an ambassadorial spark for that, if that makes sense.
Right.
And so
it's nice. So your work is really, in a way, and I hear from so many artists I interview, that making a work hyper local can be really fruitful.
And I mean, what a beautiful opportunity, especially today. We have tools of the internet to where not only can I help do that, but I mean, my gosh, every single tribe, we've got over 530 tribes in the United States, and all of us have websites, and we all have cultural programs. We have our own outreach programs in which we go to local schools and do cultural demonstrations and dances, and we have our own cultural events that the public is invited to. I mean, there's lots going on in Indian country, and to be able to be a catalyst of awareness is a real privilege for me. And it's something I get very excited about. And it's part of my mission is to help that awareness. I really want Americans to feel very, very proud of Native people and the fact that we are a very deep part of the fabric of the United States. And so to me, I'm just enriched with so much opportunity to help that. So with that in mind, I like to really, create a work that's focused on a tribal culture that's local to that organization. So then what I do is I have lots of friends around Indian country. So I immediately start making phone calls about, what's comfortable, what's appropriate, all those kinds of things. Because, I'm Chickasaw, I'm not Haida, I'm not Lakota. And so I want to be very, very thoughtful about the work that I'm doing, because my intention is that the works that I'm creating are in homage to my native cousins around North America. And I want to be very, very thoughtful and considerate as well. So I just start with phone calls and I start talking, and that's how I start the whole process. And so some of the cultures I'm much more familiar with, and some I'm not. I learn, and of course then a lot of people have not met a Chickasaw person themselves, with from another tribe, and so that's something that's really fun about Indian country, is that we all really love learning about each other and shaking hands and joking around and developing our relationships with each other. And so it's not just for other Americans, but also for Indian country. I really, really enjoy helping all American Indians, learning about each other. So there's a lot of those levels going on.
When an ensemble orchestra commissions you to create a new piece, how do you work with them? How do you set up expectations regarding research expectations? Because I imagine an average classical ensemble may not have all the instruments needed, for instance, for the sound you're creating. So yeah, how do you create that relationship with a commissioning body to make sure that they'll be able to present your piece as you want it heard?
That's a terrific question. Well, first of all, I'm really let's see here, I guess, judicious about using other native instruments in the orchestra, because I don't like to just kind of jam them together, like it's got to make artistic sense for me to do that. And so I do combine native instruments with the orchestra, but it's generally in the percussion, and it's sparse, because the orchestra itself is the color palette that I need. So it's very much like another American Indian painter, where they're using acrylics or oil on a canvas with paintbrushes that aren't necessarily an indigenous style of materials, but they're using color palettes that we didn't have in the past, and so they're able to create a brand new expression of their tribal identity. And so that's what I'm doing with the orchestra. I mean, these are phenomenally developed instruments that can create any possible color that I want to. And so when I'm creating colors that hearken to our cultures, I'm using it in a very elusive manner. Like, and I'm abstracting as well. So I'm not making like literal transcriptions of like, okay, this is the literal music. If we're gonna do that, then just go to a stomp dance and listen to stomp dancing. That's the music, the folk music, straight up. But what I'm doing is I'm abstracting, like all artists do. It's like a poet abstracts their language in all languages. And when you do that, you're literally deconstructing the language and breaking all the rules and reconstructing it in a way that is dreamy or rhapsodic. It's not the original language. And so that's what I'm doing with symphonic music. And so there's just all kinds of ways that I can do that. I have a signature sound that's very Tate-like. And so there are different things that I do that are characteristic of me, but that are very driven by an ethos that I feel around North American Indian culture in general. So I have that, just like Bartók does. Like Bartók has a very, very specific Hungarian ethos that he brings into his own folk music. I mean, he's a very good example of that. I mean, the guy was transcribing music of his own people, creating harmonies and scales, and he had his own ethos that was reflective of his own people. I'm doing something very, very similar to that. And he wasn't deliberately just throwing in traditional instruments or a traditional singer like singing straight up. It was all abstracted and made into a modern art form. I'm doing something very, very similar.
As you know, especially post-pandemic, performing arts institutions all over the country have really been struggling to get audiences back. If you were handed the keys to a classical music ensemble where you are now, or near where you are, what do you think would be your first order of business?
Oh my gosh. I can tell you with great joy that we have that going on very much in Oklahoma City. So like, for instance, our music director, Alexander Micklethwaite of the Oklahoma City Philharmonic, has this entirely large embracing attitude. And he has absolutely been like, you know what, this was our cue, so we're taking the cue. And he's just absolutely programming these incredibly robust and dynamic concerts. I mean, just incredibly fulfilling repertoire that embraces all kinds of great, existing literature and new literature from new composers. This guy creates really, really dynamic and energetic and exciting programs with that in mind that you're just talking about right now. I will say this, my experience during the pandemic was really cool because I was able to see a lot of probably more, mid-level, mid-tier, I guess, if you want to put a name with that, ensembles immediately embracing the opportunities of online performances and getting, buying gear to record and to video, this kind of thing. And so when some of the gates closed, there were some other ones that opened and lots of ensembles flooded right in. Immediately, there was positive change. Whitesnake Opera Company is a really great example of that. Cerise Jacobs is the artistic director of that. We had a performance in November 2019. We were getting the performance together, and then everything locked down. And she instantly said, "I'm going to do a Zoom concert of this same concert in April." I mean, this is just 6 weeks after everything completely locked down. She had an online concert, and she said, "My biggest concern is not the audio quality. I want to make sure that we have over 100 people Zooming in to listen at the same time, because I want them to all hear each other clapping over Zoom."
Oh,
I mean, do you see what I mean?
that's
She
amazing.
immediately went over the vision of the concert and the quality. I mean, she was thinking
She
entirely.
knew what people needed.
Exactly. And I
Yeah.
mean, that was one of the first experiences I had during the pandemic, was that type of vision and optimism. I mean, she was like, I'm going to make this great for everybody involved. And she was talking about the audience immediately. We were performing with delay with each other. It was incredibly artistically infuriating to try to do a performance because Zoom hadn't, that was Zoom's call to technologically get rid of the delay. I mean, there's so many people that were called to the table to meet. It was almost like when Apollo 13, blew its oxygen tank. Immediately, everybody on the ground at Mission Control was on hand to recreate how they could keep these guys alive until they re-entered the atmosphere. Very, very similar circumstance. At ground control, I witnessed a lot of ground control, and I'm so grateful for that. And so all of this problem solving kicked in. And so I'll tell you, that's the mindset that I grabbed onto, and I see so many people continuing that mindset and seeing that as a springboard. That happened 100 years ago. We had the Spanish flu that went in, and we were spreading it through warfare. I mean, people were dying more because we were killing each other in war all over the planet, and there was an explosion of art. And so I believe that I've seen another explosion of art, and it's being created, and I'm seeing ensembles open. I'm seeing directors taking the cues. Now it's happening still. And I got to tell you, the program that we did at Carnegie Hall was another really good example. Ray Hatoda put together this incredibly diverse American program. I mean, I don't know the next time I'm going to be able to see such a colorful program. And that was at Carnegie Hall, one of the biggest quote unquote institutions of classical music, and yet one of the most cutting edge programming was happening in real time at that
And whom
hall.
did you see? Whom did you see in the audience?
An incredibly diverse audience. I got to say, I've had the pleasure of playing Carnegie Hall twice in the same year, and both of my experiences were overwhelmingly positive and unbelievably diverse. I mean, the mindset of the audiences that were attending those concerts was beautiful and robust and open and curious and exciting and colorful. I mean, just that was my experience in both concerts, in both Weill and Zenkel halls. I'm proud to say that. I mean, it's happening. This is happening.
And then finally, looking at the rest of your art making and performance calendar through 2024, what are you most looking forward to?
Oh my gosh. I just love everything. I've got all kinds of performances with local nonprofit organizations around the country, in high schools and colleges. I am going to teach at the First Americans Museum composition to young teenagers, a lot of kids who've never composed before. And so that kind of teaching, that local work to me is very, very fulfilling.
And where is this?
Well, the Composition Academy I'm doing here in Oklahoma City is part of the First Americans Museum camps. Yeah. And so I have a Native Maestro Composition Academy that I teach at for a week every summer here now, and I've been teaching academies for the last 25 years, and so this one is more frequent now here in Oklahoma City. I teach composition for a week, and these kids come in a lot of times first-time composers, and they create a new work for string quartet. And I have a professional quartet, the Cruza Quartet, that's made of principals from the Oklahoma City Philharmonic that come in and learn the music in a day and give a concert in the evening of all
Oh,
these
what an
new.
opportunity.
Oh yeah, and actually you can see the ones from last year up on my Facebook page. Those performances are up there, the films. So I film them and post them, and the kids have their new works played by a professional string quartet. So that's something that I look forward to very, very much. I'm teaching that again in June, and so there'll be a new set of 5 or 6 works by our kids from that Composition Academy. And so then also I'm premiering several works. One that I'm very proud of is an opera that's being premiered here with the Oklahoma City Philharmonic and Canterbury Voices, entitled Luxi Shali, which means shell shaker in Chickasaw. This is an opera, a 2-act opera that we will perform as a concert opera that is sung entirely in the Chickasaw language. And we have 4 American Indian opera singers coming in to sing 4 of the major leads. Kirsten Kunkel, who is Muskogee, Caitlin Morton, who is Cherokee, Mark Billy, who is Choctaw, and Grant Youngblood, who is Lumbee. They are all coming to perform Luxi Shali, or Shell Shaker, sung entirely in the Chickasaw language, on October 27th in the Civic Center Concert Hall here in Oklahoma City.
When might we who are North Carolinians hear Grant Youngblood sing your work?
That's coming up. I'm thinking 2027 is when we're looking at that. And so you will all be able to hear the Lumbee language sung by Grant Youngblood. And I'm very excited about that. And so that'll be a song cycle, probably, 20, 25-minute work, I would say, that's sung by Grant Youngblood. I'm a fan of Grant. I just love him. He's a beautiful dramatic baritone. Oh my gosh, I just love his voice. And he is quite an incredible opera singer.
If you'd like to learn more about Jerod and read this interview, please head to uncsa.edu/artrestart. Word of mouth is key to us reaching new listeners, so if you enjoyed this or any of our episodes, it would be really great if you could get the word out to a friend or two. Our theme music is by Shanghai Restoration Project. I'm Piercarlo Talenti, and on behalf of the Thomas S. Keenan Institute for the Arts, thanks for listening.